Everyone loved her. That's the phrase people kept using afterwards when they tried to explain what actually happened. She was the manager who noticed when you were having a bad day. She remembered your daughter's exam results, your father's surgery, the offhand thing you'd mentioned in a corridor 3 months earlier. When you were struggling, she was the first person in the building to sit down and actually listen. And yet, one by one, the strongest people on her team quietly left. Not the weak ones, the strong ones. The people who pushed back in meetings, who asked the awkward question, who didn't need her approval quite as badly as everyone else seemed to. Nobody could point to one incident, no shouting, no formal complaint, no obvious villain, just a slow, accumulating sense among the people who left that the warmth came with a condition attached, and the condition was compliance. Ask anyone still on that team and they'll tell you sincerely that she's wonderful. Psychology has a name for this profile, the Dark Empath, and the finding behind it is uncomfortable. The person who does the most damage in your organisation is very often not the person who can't read a room, it's the one who reads it perfectly. Here's an assumption almost everyone makes, and it's worth saying out aloud because the whole episode depends on you noticing it. We assume empathy is a safety feature. If someone can genuinely read what you're feeling, the thinking goes they'll be moved by it and that will stop them hurting you. That assumption is built into how we hire, how we promote, and how we decide who to trust with people. We look for warmth. We look for the manager who gets people. We treat emotional fluency as evidence of good character, almost automatically, as though the two things have to go together because it feels like they should. But empathy isn't one thing. Psychologists split it into two distinct systems. Cognitive empathy is the ability to accurately read what someone else is thinking and feeling, to model their inner state, almost like a map. Affective empathy is actually feeling something in response, the flinch when you see someone else flinch. These two systems can come apart, and when they do, in a particular combination, the safety feature doesn't just fail, it becomes a delivery mechanism for harm. Quick orientation for anyone new to this channel. In 2002, psychologists Delroy Paulus and Kevin Williams noticed that 3 unpleasant traits kept turning up together in ordinary people, not in prisons, in offices. Narcissism, grandiosity and a fragile ego that can't tolerate correction, Machiavellianism, cold strategic manipulation for personal advantage, and psychopathy, impulsivity, callousness, and a striking absence of remorse. They called it the Dark Triad. These aren't diagnoses, they're dimensions everyone sits somewhere on, and most of us sit fairly low. The people who concern us here sit high, and importantly, high enough to shape a team's culture without ever crossing into anything a court or a clinician would recognise. For decades, the working assumption was straightforward. High Dark Triad traits meant low empathy. The psychopath, in particular, was defined partly by an inability to read other people, a kind of emotional blindness that made their coldness almost forgivable, in the sense that they genuinely couldn't see what they were doing. In 2021, a research team at Nottingham Trent University tested that assumption directly on nearly 1,000 people. What they found broke the model people have been working with for 20 years. Empathy is not one faculty, it's two, and they run on different machinery in the brain. Cognitive empathy leans on cortical regions involved in reasoning about other minds. Affective empathy draws on deeper subcortical systems tied to feeling. Cognitive empathy is the map reading skill. It's knowing, with real accuracy, what someone else is thinking, feeling, or about to do. It's the capacity that lets a great negotiator, a great therapist, or a great con artist all read the room with equal precision. The skill itself is morally neutral. Affective empathy is a resonance. It's the involuntary flinch, the tightening in your own chest when you watch someone else in pain. It's the part that makes another person's suffering cost you something. The part that turns accurate understanding into genuine reason not to act on it. The old model of dark personality assumed both were missing, but research on the Dark Triad found something more specific. It's affective empathy that's consistently reduced. Cognitive empathy, the reading, is frequently intact, and in some people unusually sharp. That gap between the two is where this entire episode lives. Here's what the team at Nottingham Trent University actually did. Dr Nadia Haim and colleagues surveyed almost 1,000 people. They measured Dark Triad traits using validated scales. Statements such as, "Most people can be manipulated," and "It's not wise to tell your secrets." They measured cognitive and affective empathy separately using an established self-report instrument, the Questionnaire of Cognitive and Affective Empathy. Worth flagging now as it becomes important later in this episode. And they measured something else, deliberately chosen indirect aggression. Not violence, not shouting, indirect aggression. Making someone feel guilty, quietly excluding them socially, malicious jokes at someone's expense. The researchers chose this measure specifically because it's gender neutral and common enough in everyday life to yield meaningful data, rather than restricting the study to rare, extreme behaviour that would capture only a handful of participants. Then, instead of assuming everyone with high Dark Triad traits looked the same, they let the data sort people into natural groups, a technique called latent profile analysis. No categories imposed in advance, just who actually clusters with whom based on how they scored across dark traits and both types of empathy. 4 distinct groups emerged from this data, and one of them wasn't supposed to exist. 4 groups, the first making up about a third of the sample, were typicals: lower Dark Triad traits, average empathy, unremarkable. The second, also around a third, were empaths, low Dark Triad traits, high empathy on both dimensions. The people you'd hope make up most of your organisation, and, encouragingly, in this sample very nearly did. The third group, around 13%, were the classic profile everyone expected: high Dark Triad traits and low empathy on both cognitive and affective dimensions. This is a textbook cold and readable manipulator, the one the old model predicted. The fourth group is the one that shouldn't have existed under the old assumptions, and it was the largest of the dark groups, somewhere around 19 to 20% of the entire data sample. High Dark Triad traits, but also above average empathy on both measures, cognitive and, unexpectedly, affective empathy. Haim and colleagues named this profile the Dark Empath, and here's a number worth remembering. In this data sample, Dark Empaths outnumbered the classic cold Dark Triad type by roughly 1.5 to 1. It's important to clarify what the study actually measured because aggression conjures the wrong image. This isn't shouting or physical threat, it's indirect aggression, and once you see the list, you'll recognise it immediately from somewhere in your own working life. Guilt induction, making someone feel responsible for your disappointment without ever stating what you actually want from them. Social exclusion, quietly leaving someone off the invitation, the thread, the credit, nothing you could screenshot or take to HR. Malicious humour, the joke at someone's expense, delivered with enough warmth in the room that objective makes you look humourless. None of these behaviours are dramatic on their own. That's the point, and precisely why they're so hard to name, let alone act on. There's no incident report for, somehow every time I contribute to that meeting, the conversation moves on half a beat too fast. Both dark groups scored higher on this kind of aggression than the typicals and the empaths. I want to be precise about the margins though, because they matter. In this original sample, the classic Dark Triad group scored substantially higher than the Dark Empaths. Not marginally higher, clearly higher across all 3 subscales. Haim summates his own summary of their data say it plainly. Dark Empaths appear to have the capacity to be callous and ruthless, but they seem able to limit it. So the empathy is doing something. What it's not doing is taking the behaviour off the table. The Dark Empaths still sat above the typicals and the empaths, most clearly on malicious humour and guilt induction, and they were doing it with a completely different social toolkit. Here's the finding that makes the profile genuinely dangerous rather than merely interesting. When the Nottingham Trent team compared personality profiles across the 4 groups, Dark Empaths came out more extraverted than every other group in the study. More sociable, more energetic, more drawn to people. And on agreeableness, while they scored lower than empaths and typicals, they scored meaningfully higher than the classic Dark Triad group. The classic Dark Triad type is, socially, fairly easy to spot eventually. Cold, detached, low in warmth. Colleagues develop an instinct for it, even if they can't articulate why. That coldness is the tell. The Dark Empath doesn't give you that tell. They're, by the numbers, the most socially fluent and outwardly warm profile in the entire Dark cluster. The same charm that makes the classic manipulator's absence of it so noticeable is, in this profile, fully present and genuinely convincing to the people experiencing it. This is not a person performing a mask badly. The social skill is real, which is exactly why trust your gut, you'll know a bad one when you see one, is such dangerous and unreliable advice here. A reasonable challenge at this point. Maybe the aggression scores in that first study were modest enough not to worry about. Maybe the empathy really does soften things meaningfully, even if it doesn't eliminate the antagonism entirely. Haim has since run a follow-up study and presented it at academic conferences. With a sample of nearly 800 American participants, and I want to flag clearly that this replication has not yet been published in a peer-reviewed journal, so treat it as preliminary rather than settled. But the direction of the finding is worth knowing. In this larger sample, the gap between the 2 dark groups narrowed substantially. The Dark Empath's aggression levels came in a close to level with the classic Dark Triad group, not softened into safety, just redirected into a different channel. In that larger sample, the empathy did not appear to reduce the underlying antagonism, and I want to be careful with that because the published 2021 data did show a clear gap between the 2 groups. It's the unpublished follow-up that closes it, and until that's peer-reviewed, the published gap is a better supported finding. Researchers describe what remains an antagonistic core. The presence of empathy limits how the darkness is expressed, without eliminating the darkness itself. It gives it manners, it gives it a slower, quieter delivery system. It does not give it a conscience. That distinction is the entire episode in one sentence, and it's worth pausing on before we move on to what it looks like in a real team. There's an earlier study by the same research group that directly explains the mechanism. In 2019, Haim and colleagues studied about 300 people and examined how empathy links Dark Triad traits to this kind of indirect aggression. They found that one specific facet of cognitive empathy, online simulation, the capacity to model someone else's inner state in real time, and not affective empathy partially mediated the path from psychopathy and Machiavellianism to indirect relational aggression. Narcissism didn't show that link. And to be fair to the paper, its own headline conclusion was that the data did not support a single shared empathy deficit underlying all 3 traits. Read that carefully because it inverts the intuitive story, and I want to keep the claim about the effect size the evidence actually supports. This was partial mediation by one facet for 2 of the 3 traits. It's not a complete explanation of anything, but the direction is the point. That facet of cognitive empathy was not functioning as a brake. It was part of the root. Knowing exactly what will wound someone, precisely where their insecurity sits, exactly which joke will land as a joke to everyone except its target, that requires accurate cognitive empathy. The affective piece, the part that would normally make you flinch at causing that wound, is the piece running low. This is the single most important reframe in this episode. We've spent a generation treating reads people well as a character reference. The research here says reading people well is a skill. Whether it's used with a conscience attached is an entirely separate question. And empathy training teaches a skill, not the conscience. Hold that thought. We'll come back to exactly what that means for empathy training budgets later in this episode. Let's put this to work in the setting this channel focuses on most, the workplace. Call it the caring boss pattern. This is the manager who deploys warmth strategically, who's generous with praise and support toward people who are useful or compliant, and who withdraws that same warmth subtly and undeniably from anyone who challenges them. The mechanism is cognitive empathy, doing exactly what it does best, reading with real precision what each person on the team needs to hear in order to stay loyal, stay quiet, or stay grateful. It isn't performed badly, it's performed extremely well, because the underlying skill is genuinely excellent. What makes this specifically dangerous in a leadership role is the asymmetry of information. The employee experiencing the warmth has no way of knowing whether it's contingent until they test the boundary, until they disagree, push back, or become inconvenient. By then, they're often isolated because everyone else on the team has only ever experienced the warm version and will not easily believe your account of the other. Whether this profile is specifically overrepresented in senior roles is not something the published evidence settles. I'll come back to that, honestly, in a few minutes because it matters how confident we're entitled to be in these research findings. HR systems are built to catch incidents. A shouted insult, a written threat, a single gross violation of policy that someone can point to, document and escalate. Indirect aggression is specifically engineered, whether consciously or not, to never produce that kind of evidence. This is death by 1,000 teasers. No single joke, exclusion or guilt-laden comment clears the bar for a formal complaint. Taken individually, every one of them survives the question, would this sound reasonable if I explained it to someone else? It's only in accumulation over months that a pattern becomes visible, and by the time it's visible to the person experiencing it, it's usually invisible to everyone else because they've only seen the isolated, deniable instances. The targets of this pattern often describe the same experience, a slow erosion of confidence they can't quite pin down, a sense of being slightly persistently wrong-footed, and a real difficulty explaining any of it convincingly to a third party, including HR. She's actually lovely to me is a genuine and common response colleagues give when someone finally does try to raise it. The system isn't failing to catch it, the system was never built to catch it. This creates a genuinely uncomfortable problem for well-meaning organisations. Empathy training, active listening, perspective-taking exercises, emotional intelligence workshops, is built on a reasonable premise. Teach people to read others better and working relationships will improve. For the overwhelming majority of your workforce, that premise holds, but cognitive empathy is a trainable skill, and training doesn't discriminate based on what someone intends to do with it. If a small number of people in that room already have the antagonistic core this episode has been describing, sharpening their ability to read exactly what makes a colleague vulnerable is not a neutral intervention. This is not an argument against empathy training. The evidence doesn't support scrapping something that helps the larger majority of people on the basis of a small minority who might misuse it. That would be its own serious error. It's an argument for pairing skill building with accountability structures that don't rely on the trained skill being used in good faith. Documented decision trails, multiple channels for raising concerns, and leaders who are evaluated on patterns over time rather than on isolated glowing feedback. Teach the skill, don't assume the skill implies the conscience. They're not the same purchase, and an organisation that conflates them is, in effect, subsidising the very capability it most needs to keep in check. The classic Dark Triad type tends to fail loudly and relatively fast. Impulsivity, low affective empathy, and no real break on antagonism produce complaints, confrontations, and a trail people can point to. Colleagues develop a shared articulable story. Everyone knew something was off about him. The Dark Empath's failure mode looks nothing like that, and this is a central practical problem this episode exists to name. The destruction tends to be slower, more intimate, and much harder to point at. A capable colleague who quietly stops applying for promotion. A team that keeps losing its best people for reasons nobody can quite articulate at exit interviews. A friendship group that thins out over years without anyone naming why. What people who've been on the receiving end consistently describe, according to the researchers that study this, isn't a story, it's a feeling, a vague, hard-to-defend sense that something's not quite right about this person, alongside genuine evidence warmth that makes the feeling sound paranoid, even to the person having it. That feeling is data. It deserves to be taken seriously, even when, especially when, you can't yet build a case file around it. We'll come back to exactly how to build that case file methodically before this episode ends. Organisations select for exactly the traits this profile has in abundance. Extraversion reads as leadership presence. Cognitive empathy reads as emotional intelligence. Warmth reads as culture fit. Every filter most companies use to identify who should rise to the top is, unintentionally, a filter this profile passes with ease, even more easily than a genuinely warm, non-strategic colleague standing next to them, because the genuine version isn't performing for the interview panel. This connects to a wider, well-established pattern in the corporate psychopathy literature. Fabiak, Neumann and Hare's 2010 study of senior managers found psychopathic traits at roughly 3 to 4 times the rate seen in the general population. A concentration that increases, not decreases, at higher organisational levels. That research is specifically about the classic code profile, and I want to be precise about that distinction. What researchers working in this area do say is that positions of power generally attract people high in dark traits, because power is itself the draw. Whether the Dark Empath specifically outpromotes the classic code profile has not, as far as I can establish, been tested directly. So let me be clear. The next sentence is an inference, not a finding. If selection systems reward social fluency, and this profile has social fluency in abundance, while the classic profile conspicuously does not, then the profile most likely to survive selection is the one you'll find hardest to see. That's a reasoned prediction from the personality data. It should remain as a prediction until somebody tests it. The people best equipped to notice this pattern are, structurally, the ones least likely to be in the room where it's decided. A necessary caution before we go further, because this material is easy to misinterpret and misuse. Most of the warm, socially skilled, emotionally attuned people in your life are exactly what they appear to be. Genuine empathy and social confidence are common, ordinary, healthy traits, and the overwhelming majority of people who read a room well are simply good at reading rooms. This isn't a checklist for diagnosing your colleagues, your boss, or your friends from a video. Dark Triad traits sit on a continuum everyone occupies to some degree, and this profile, even at its true prevalence, remains a minority pattern, not an epidemic. Confusing assertive, emotionally direct, or simply someone I dislike with Dark Empath does real damage to them and to your own ability to trust the people who deserve your trust. What distinguishes this profile isn't warmth. It's warmth combined with a documented, repeated pattern of indirect aggression and consistency in how someone treats you when they need something from you versus when they don't. One data point is a bad day. A pattern over time across multiple relationships is what the research is actually describing. Hold both of those thoughts at once because the rest of this episode depends on it. So, what actually helps? Not slogans, structure. The framework I use for this across the channel is strong situations. The idea that clear rules, real consequences, and close observation compress the room for any personality trait, dark or otherwise, to express itself unchecked. A strong situation doesn't require you to diagnose anyone's personality accurately. It just removes the conditions the pattern depends on. Concretely, for leaders, build genuine multi-source feedback into how people are evaluated. 360-degree feedback from peers and direct reports, not just upward-facing charm assessed by the one person with promotion power. track team attrition and engagement by manager over time, not just by headline satisfaction scores, because this pattern shows up in slow attrition of your strongest people long before it shows up in a survey. Separate well-liked by leadership from well-liked by the people with no power in the relationship as two genuinely distinct signals, and weight the second one more heavily than most organisations currently do. And take documented pattern concerns from multiple independent sources seriously, even when the person concerned is, by every account, warm, popular and difficult to imagine doing anything wrong. Especially then, in fact, because that's precisely the condition this pattern depends on to survive scrutiny. If you're the person experiencing this right now, here's what actually helps, based on what the people who study this pattern consistently recommend. Trust the vague feeling enough to start documenting, even before you can name it. Write down what happened, when, and how it made you feel in plain factual language, close to the moment it occurs. A pattern is invisible in memory and very visible on a page across 3 months. Triangulate deliberately. Ask, carefully and privately, whether anyone else has noticed anything similar, not as gossip, but because this pattern relies on isolating you with an experience no one else can corroborate. You're very often not alone in it. Separate the behaviour from the warmth when you describe it to someone else. Don't lead with, "she's not actually nice." That's a losing argument against someone with genuine social skill. Lead with a specific repeated pattern, what was said, what happened next, how many times. And protect your own reality testing. The self-doubt this pattern produces is not a sign you're overreacting. It's frequently the clearest evidence that something real is happening, and a good therapist, trusted friend, or, where relevant, a HR professional operating outside the immediate chain of command can help you test that instinct against an outside view. In the interest of maintaining a high evidential standard on every video on this channel, here's the most serious challenge to everything you've just heard. The 2021 Heim study measured empathy entirely through self-report, people rating their own perspective taking and emotional responsiveness. In 2023, Fino and colleagues re-examined dark personality and emotional intelligence using the same person-centered approach, and did not find a clean, replicated Dark Empath profile in the data. And in 2025, a network analysis by Grabovac and colleagues went further, adding an objective performance-based test of cognitive empathy. Essentially, you can actually read a stranger's emotion from their eyes, accurately under test conditions, rather than relying on self-rating at all. On that objective measure, the picture changed. The relationship between Dark Triad traits and real empathic ability came out weak or non-existent. The honest reading is that the Dark Empath's high empathy may partly be self-report, what narcissistic self-enhancement can produce on a questionnaire, while the ability to genuinely resonate with another person may be more limited than the self-ratings suggest. What isn't in dispute across every version of this literature is the behaviour. Elevated indirect aggression delivered through genuine social skill. Whether the underlying empathy is fully genuine or partly self-flattery, the pattern in front of you and the caution it warrants stays the same. It's also worth noting separately a large meta-analysis of over 100 effect sizes that found only a weak overall link between empathy and aggression in general. A reminder that this entire field is still actively contested, not a closed case. There's another challenge worth putting on a table about the language I've been using throughout this episode. In 2025, 3 of the most senior researchers in this area, David Chester, Donald Lynham and Joshua Miller, writing in the Journal of Psychopathology and Clinical Science, argued that psychology should abandon the word dark entirely in favour of antagonistic, on the grounds that it's stigmatizing, sensationalizing and imprecise. I use the established term in this series because it's the one in the literature and the search engines are still using it. But they have a serious point, and antagonistic may well be the term this field settles on in future. So, the manager everyone loved. By now you can probably describe her more precisely than everyone loved her. high in the traits that produce manipulation, high, genuinely, in the empathy that was supposed to be the safety feature against it. The warmth was real, the condition attached to it was also real. Both things at once. That's the whole finding. The practical takeaway isn't paranoia, it's recalibration. Warmth isn't evidence of safety, consistency is. Watch what happens to someone's warmth when you stop being useful to them, disagree with them, or become inconvenient. That's the test the charm can't fake indefinitely, because it requires sustained affective investment the profile, by definition, just doesn't have. I'm Dr Nick Keca. This is a second instalment in our Dark Personalities at Work series. If you want the details, you can read the full article on my website, including the academic references. The web address is on the screen now. If this video describes someone in your working life, you're not imagining it. Document it, you don't have to solve it alone. If you haven't seen the first episode in this series on how these same patterns show up in the AI systems now used by everybody in your organisation, it's linked below. This may change how you'll read everything after this. The next episode in this series, The Bad Apple Effect, and how a single dark personality can reshape an entire team's culture and performance. Thanks for watching. If you found this video interesting, please like and subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you in the next one.